Today we're starting on page 244, which of Listen Humanity, which is the appendix 2, and it's titled Reminiscences. Baba often reminisced during the Savas month, particularly when he showed the Savasis places near Ahmednagar that were associated with his early activities. The fact that a number of the Mandali and Savasis had shared in the events, which rendered these spots memorable, added to the flavor of the retelling. The various reminiscences by Baba and members of the Savas group have been regrouped here for the purposes of consecutive narration and are not therefore in the sequence in which they were originally given. It should always be borne in mind also that Baba's gestures convey an essential idea. This in turn is clothed with words by one of the Mandali. And there's an asterisk at Mandali. Baba gave up communication via the alphabet board in October 1954. Back to the text. Therefore, the words are not always Baba's very own, unless he chooses tediously to have a word spelled out. But the sense is his. One afternoon, in commenting on a performance just given by the Telugu group of his own Barakatha, the story of Baba's life dramatically portrayed in song and dance, Baba had Erich tell of events concerning Baba's birth, which had been described to Erich's mother by Baba's mother, Shireen Mai. Shireen Mai had an unusual dream just a few days before Baba's birth, February 25th, 1894. In the dream, she was led to a wide open area where she was rapidly surrounded by a sea of foreign appearing people extending on all sides to the horizons. Shireen Mai felt that all the strangers were looking steadily and expectantly towards her. She awoke in a state of alarm. When she described this dream to relatives and friends, an elderly person told her that rather than worry, she should feel happy, as the symbolism of the dream indicated that the child, Baba, would be awaited and esteemed by vast numbers of people. On another occasion, Ramju retold more of Shireen Mai's stories. Merwan Baba, Merwan Shariar Irani was Baba's birth name, had been my problem even as a child. Some months after his birth, I dreamed that I was standing in the doorway. The doorway of our house, holding Merwan in my arms. I saw that there was a well nearby in the compound. That's the court of the house. The figure of a striking woman, like a Hindu goddess, was rising out of the center of the well. I could clearly see the lavish green sari in which she was dressed, and the many green bangles with which she was adorned. Bright flowered designs were painted on her forehead in many colors, and in her hands she held a tray containing flowers, a lighted lamp, and other articles used by Hindus in their worship. I stood motionless in fascination until the weird figure beckoned to me to hand Merwan over to her. Trying to hold him all the more tightly, I was awakened from the dream. Shireen Mai had continued her telling of her early worries about her precocious child. Merwan was very active and mischievous from the time he was able to toddle, and would walk out of the house when my attention was distracted. This often compelled me, when I was especially busy with housework or had to go for my bath and there was no one in the house to look after him, to tie one end of my sari to his waist and the other to the bedstead. Even then, I could not always keep him out of mischief. Once, it was about January 1895, I had left him playing on the floor. Returning to the room some minutes later, I was horrified to see him playing merrily with a big black snake. This time it wasn't a dream. With a piercing scream, I rushed forward, but the snake slipped quickly out of the house and was never seen again. Several days later, Baba described the all-important occasion when the great Sufi saint, Hazrat Babajan, kissed him on the forehead, tearing away the veil which obscured his own God realization. When the 5 perfect masters bring me down, they draw a veil over me. Although Babajan was in the form of a woman, she was one of them, the 5 perfect masters, and she unveiled me in my present form. With just a kiss on the forehead between the eyebrows, Babajan made me experience, in May 1913, thrills of indescribable bliss, which continued for about 9 months. Then one night, in January 1914, she made me realize in a flash the infinite bliss of self-realization, God realization. At the time Babajan gave me the Nirvikalp, that's inconceptual experience of my own reality, the illusory physical, subtle, and mental bodies, mind, worlds, and one and all created things ceased to exist for me, even as illusion. Then I began to see that only I and nothing else existed. The infinite bliss of my self-realization was, is, and will remain continuous. At the moment, I experience both infinite bliss as well as infinite suffering. Once I drop the body, only bliss will remain. But after I became self-conscious, I could not have said all this, nor could I say it even now if it had not been for the indescribable spiritual agonies which I passed through for another period of 9 months until October 1914. in returning to normal consciousness of the suffering of others. During those 9 months, I remained in a state which no one else could have tolerated for even 9 days. After physical death, an ordinary man is usually dead to the world, and the world is dead to him. Yet he continues to live his discarnate life beyond the sphere of gross existence. During the first 3 days of my superconscious state, January 1914, I was truly dead to everybody and everything other than my own infinite reality. Although my physical body continued to function more or less normally. Actually dead, though really living, I was consequently considered by others to be seriously ill. I was allowed to remain in bed, lying with wide open, vacant eyes which saw nothing. When man, the individualized soul, enters the seventh plane, which is the one and only plane of reality, his consciousness is fully freed once and for all from everything else. It then is wholly occupied by the reality of the real self or God. So it is said that the individual soul becomes superconscious or God conscious. To other souls who function within the illusion of duality, the God conscious one may seem to be physically as much alive as they are. Nevertheless, regardless of the fact that the superconscious one's gross, subtle, and mental bodies may remain functioning, he is dead to illusion for all time. His consciousness has transcended the illusory limitations of births and deaths that lie within the illusion of duality. The conscious state of God is known only to those who have achieved it. Such a state of realization of divine oneness is completely beyond the domain of mind itself. It is rare for man to become superconscious. 1 in millions might achieve it. It is rarer still for the God conscious to be able to return with God consciousness to normal consciousness of all the illusory existences, gross, subtle, and mental, as a perfect master. Usually, the gross, subtle, and mental bodies of the God conscious one automatically drop within 4 days if, after attaining superconsciousness, he does not begin to return to normal consciousness of the illusory world of duality. And that is, duality is starred. The asterisk says, for a more complete discussion, see part 2, chapter 6, the ways to the path and its states and stages. Back to the text. In an unusual case, all 3 bodies of the God conscious one continue to function indefinitely in the relative higher and lower spheres of illusion. Then, for others, such a one is truly the ever-living dead, a real Majzub-e-Kamil, or conscious God in the midst of illusion, conscious humanity. To touch such a one is to touch God himself. In my case, I did not drop the body on the 4th day, nor did I become established in the gross sphere as a majzub, nor did I begin to regain the normal consciousness of a perfect master. Only such a perfect one is capable of knowing the state in which I had to remain for 9 months. On the fourth day and after, I was slightly conscious of my body and began to move about without any consciousness of my surroundings. I received no promptings from my mind as would an ordinary man. I had no knowledge of the things I did or did not do. I did not sleep and had no appetite. No one had any idea throughout this period that I sat, talked, walked, lay down, and did everything by instinct, more like an automaton than an ordinary human being. My sleepless, staring, vacant eyes worried my mother most. She believed and told others that I had gone mad. In her anguish, she could not refrain from going once to Baba John and demanding to know what she had done to me. Shireen Mai did this because she knew that I used to go and sit near Baba John for a while each night during the previous 9 months, May 1913 to January 1914. Baba John indicated to my mother that I was intended to shake the world into wakefulness, but that meant nothing to Shireen Mai in her distress. For a long time, I was given regular medical treatment, but no amount of drugging and injections could put me to sleep. As Shireen Mai used to say, having exhausted all available means, she sent me to Bombay to stay with Jamshed for a change. Jamshed was Baba's late early brother. Thinking to keep me occupied with day-to-day activities, Jamshed encouraged me to cook the food for the two of us. Sometimes I did the cooking all right, but I did it as I did other things, without knowing what I was doing. I can recall the particular bench in the Victoria Gardens on which I passed most of the time, sitting alone, entirely oblivious of the world and its affairs. Although the infinite bliss I experienced in my superconscious state remained continuous, as it is now, I suffered agonies in returning towards normal consciousness of illusion. Occasionally, to gain some sort of relief, I used to knock my head so furiously against walls and windows that some of them showed cracks. In reality, there is no suffering as such, only infinite bliss. Although suffering is illusory, still, within the realm of illusion, it is suffering. In the midst of illusion, Baba John established my reality. My reality, although untouched by illusion, remained connected with illusion. That was why I suffered incalculable spiritual agonies. 9 months after my self-realization, November 1914, I began to be somewhat conscious of my surroundings. Life returned to my vacant eyes. Although I would not sleep, I began regularly to eat small quantities of food. And food is starred, and the asterisk says, it an incredible fact that Baba did not eat for the 9 months following his self-realization in January 1914. Back to the text. I now knew what I was doing, but I continued to do things intuitively, as if impelled to do them by inner forces. I did not do things of my own accord or when asked by others. For example, when I began to teach Persian, that was in December 1915, to Bua Sahib, and Bua Sahib has a dagger, and the dagger says, the late Bayram F. Irani, the first and one of the closest of Baba's disciples. So back to the text. For example, when I began to teach Persian in December 1915 to Bua Sahib, my mother tried to collect more pupils for me, thinking this would hasten my recovery. But I would attend to no one else and continued to teach only Bua Sahib. Later on, April 1915, I also began to go for long distances on foot or by vehicle. Once I left Pune by rail for Raichur, more than 300 miles south of Pune. But after traveling for only 34 miles, I felt the urge to leave the train at Kedgaon. There, for the first time, I came in physical contact with Narayan Maharaj, one of the 5 perfect masters, whose ashram is not far from that railway station. Similarly, from time to time, I was also drawn to see Majzubs like Banamiyan Baba at Aurangabad and Tipu Baba at Bombay. Once, in the company of Bayram, that's Bua Sahib, I traveled as far north as Nagpur and saw Tajuddin Baba, another of the 5 perfect masters. Finally, in December 1915, I felt impelled to call on Sai Baba, the perfect master among masters. At that time, he was returning in a procession from Lendi in Shirdi, a place to and from which he was led every day in order to ease himself. Despite the crowds, I intuitively prostrated myself before him on the road. When I arose, Sai Baba looked straight at me and exclaimed, Parvardigar, parentheses, God Almighty Sustainer, close parentheses. I then felt drawn to walk to the nearby temple of Khandaba, in which Maharaj, that is Sri Upasani Maharaj, was staying in seclusion. He had been living on water there under Sai Baba's direct guidance for over 3 years. At that time, Maharaj was reduced almost to a skeleton due to his fast on water. He was also naked and surrounded by filth. When I came near enough to him, Maharaj greeted me, so to speak, with a stone, which he threw at me with great force. It struck me on my forehead, exactly where Babajan had kissed me, hitting with such force that it drew blood. The mark of that injury is still on my forehead. But that blow from Maharaj was the stroke of Gnayan, parentheses, Marafat of Hakikat, or divine knowledge, close parentheses. Figuratively, Maharaj had started to rouse me from sound sleep. But in sound sleep, man is unconscious, while I, being superconscious, was wide awake in sound sleep. With that stroke, Maharaj had begun to help me return to ordinary consciousness of the realm of illusion. That was the beginning of my present infinite suffering in illusion, which I experience simultaneously with my infinite bliss in reality. But it took me 7 years of acute struggle under Maharaj's active guidance to return completely to and become established in normal human consciousness of the illusion of duality, while yet experiencing continuously my superconsciousness. The more normally conscious I became, the more acute my suffering grew. For years, therefore, I continued to knock my head frequently on stones. That was how I eventually lost all my teeth, for through the constant knocking, they became prematurely loose. This also resulted in a wound, which was constantly fresh, and therefore I always used to keep a colored handkerchief tied around my forehead. The more I returned to worldly normality, the more impatient my mother became to see me settled into the routine of life. To satisfy her, I joined the Khan, that's the Kabazji Katan, the Khan Katan theatrical company as its manager, 1916, and traveled with the show to Lahore. Several years later, after becoming almost 3/4 normally consciousness, while retaining full superconsciousness, I went to Sakori and stayed for 6 months, July to December 1921, near Maharaj. At the end of this period, Maharaj made me know fully what I am, just as Baba John had made me feel in a flash what I am. During those 6 months, Maharaj and I used to sit near each other in a hut behind closed doors almost every night. On one such occasion, Maharaj folded his hands to me and said, "Mirwan, you are the avatar, and I salute you." For about 4 months after this, January to May 1922, I stayed in a small jopti, or thatched hut. It was built for me temporarily on the edge of some fields in the very thinly populated area of what is now the Shivajinagar area of Pune. In this manner, I began to live independently, surrounded by men who formed the nucleus of the Mandalay. One of these was the first to start addressing me as Baba. Baba is starred, and the asterisk says, Meher Baba means literally compassionate father. Some of the men were drawn intuitively to me long before they had any clear idea of my inner state. Others were attracted to me by hints from Baba John and Maharaj. And still others I drew directly to me. At that time, both Baba John and Maharaj began telling various people, referring to me that, quote, the child is now capable of moving the whole world at a sign from his finger, end quote. Once, in May 1922, Maharaj addressed a large gathering of the Mandali and said, listen to me most carefully. I have handed over my key of spiritual charge now to Merwan, and henceforth you are all to stick to him and do as he instructs you. With God's grace, you will soon reach the goal. Still others, Maharaj asked individually to follow me. In 1922, Baba established his first and ideal ashram in Bombay, which was called the Manzili Meme, abode of capital letter M. I guess that's the master, abode of the master. Here, more than 40 men of various faiths and qualifications stayed night and day with Baba for 10 months, leading a routine life of rigorous discipline. In those days, Baba would often become temperamentally violent, but showed no trace of malice in his actions. His actions are daggered. Dagger says, this quote unquote Jalali or fiery phase is not uncommon among perfect masters. The recipient of the apparent anger understands it to be of spiritual benefit and a blessing to him. My body, he commented, was then very lean, but also supple, as I was constantly and energetically active. From 4 in the morning, even in the severest cold, I would move about in my thin mul sadra, or robe. Those who did not know me well at that time might well have considered me very quick-tempered, for suddenly, with or without provocation, I would beat anyone at hand. In those days, most of the Mandali were hefty, robust young men. Several of them were good wrestlers, and some were seasoned athletes. But when I would start for a brisk walk, the majority would have to run to keep up with me. Sometimes I would ask them all to press collectively on my whole body with all the force they could exert. Within a few minutes, they would be breathless and drenched with perspiration without having fully satisfied me. One of the group had the physique of a giant, but once in a certain mood, I knocked him down with a single slap. Another had to have a doctor treat his ear because of a blow I gave him. One of the Mandali used to go into hiding at once on such occasions and would not emerge again without asking others if my mood had changed. On one occasion, the Mandali and Baba were sitting together in good spirits in the big upstairs hall in the Manzili Meme when Baba suddenly seized a plump fellow of about 200 pounds, dragged him like a rag doll to the edge of the stairs and flung him down. The place rang with the crashes as the heavy man rolled and tumbled to the bottom. Baba then struck another of the Mandali a sharp blow on the forehead, stepping back with a smile as if nothing had happened. Both of the victims of the sudden outburst were quizzed with considerable concern by Baba as to whether they had suffered any injuries, but neither was any the worse for the squall. Aside from these unpredictable moments of violence, Baba always appeared to be busy with various duties aimed at the physical, mental, moral, and spiritual welfare of the Mandali. In his usual candid fashion, Baba closed his own and the Mandali's reminiscences of these early years with the unarguable statement, when the money was finished, we came over to Arangaon. Then, for more than a year and a half, to the end of 1924, Baba moved almost constantly with the Mandali about the country, once going as far as Iran. Occasionally, on arriving at some new place, Baba would say that they were going to settle down there for a long time. But no sooner had the Mandali finished the preliminary arrangements than Baba would start them on the move again. It was a period of hard labor for the Mandali, great privation for Baba, and fatiguing travel by third-class rail or foot over great distances for all. Awesome, Jay. Go ahead and unmute and begin reading for us, please.
Can you show me where we are?
Sure.
Okay. Jai Baba. For various spiritual reasons, Baba continued his reminiscences, and due to the nature of the work I was then doing, I was unable to eat regularly. Practically speaking, therefore, I was fasting almost all the time. For months, I would take no food or drink except at intervals of 36 or more hours. At times, I also subsisted for a week or two at a stretch on a few sips of liquids such as tea, milk, or dal soup. I did not fast for the sake of fasting, and I suffered and felt weak, just as any ordinary man who fasts. During World War I, Meherabad was a military camp divided, then as now, by the railroad to Ahmednagar into an upper hill section to the west and the lower fields part to the east. When I arrived here with the Mandali for the first time, April 1923, the whole area was desolate and filled with thorns and snakes and scorpions. The military buildings were in ruins. In contrast to the life at Manzili Mim, has a star on it, says, here the training involved rigorous mental discipline rather than actual physical hardships. Back to the text. The Mandali now had to do everything without the help of hired labor. They had to draw water, cook food, wash clothes, carry loads, and work all day as common laborers, as well as carry out promptly the various instructions I gave them. Although Baba came initially to Arangaon, which is Meherabad, with the Mandali ostensibly to settle there, they stayed only 4 days on that occasion. The second stay lasted 11 days, and the third only 2. The longest stay before 1925 was the fourth, which lasted 3 months. This period, March through May 1924, was known among his Mandali as Gamela Yoga, the practice of regular hard labor. This was the period when the camp was largely restored. By that time, May, Baba commented, the abandoned camp was almost ship-shape again. The first new building was called the Agrakuti, also called Jopti, a small square room, solidly constructed of stones and mortar, and made insect-proof by screen placed over all openings. where I have sat in seclusion and worked on a number of occasions for various periods of time. Other than for one paid mason, all the construction, clearing, repairing, etc. was done by the mandali, who worked like coolies for 6 hours each day. They worked so hard that most had blisters on their hands. After several months, January 1925, we settled down and the place gradually became known as Meherabad. For almost 2 years, until November 1926, it was like a small model town. In it lived about 500 souls working in the hospital, the dispensary, and the schools. There were also ashrams for boys, men, and women, and shelters for the poor and for lepers, all of which were established here in connection with my work. At that time, nearly 1,000 rupees a day used to be spent for the maintenance of the various services, while the mandali often lived on plain dal and rice for lunch and milkless tea, or a thin soup of methi, bitter spinach leaves, and coarse bread for dinner. During that period, I remained generally on liquids or on limited meals taken once in a week for a fortnight. Weekly rations were issued to the most helpless of the Erangown villagers. They were so needy that later, when the ashrams were shifted some scores of miles away to Toka, they used to travel on foot or by bullock cart all that distance rather than miss the weekly quota of coarse grain. Hundreds of people from the villages near Meherabad benefited from the free hospitals, and thousands utilized the dispensary provided for outpatients. Boys of all castes and creeds, including untouchables, soon began to live, eat, and intermingle freely. From dawn to dusk, I would move about the place and take an active part in every phase, including the cleaning of late latrines. Each day, I spent 3 to 4 hours bathing the school children. When the boarding became considerable, I allowed the mandali to share the service with me. All the mandali also had to grind grain for 1 to 3 hours each day, depending upon their assigned duties. I also shared in the daily grinding for an hour or more. Despite my silence, starting July 10, 1925, I continued all my usual activities. At that time, I communicated by writing on a slate, and also for more than a year, wrote for a number of hours daily on work, which remains unseen and unpublished to this day. I did most of my writing work in my small cupboard-like room constructed underneath the big wooden table which stands near the duni, sacred fireplace. It was at this time, November 1925, that we began to light the duni each month. At certain fixed hours, I saw visitors freely. Hundreds came daily for my darshan, believing in my spiritual status, but most sought my blessing only for material benefit. On special occasions, the stream of visitors would continue unbroken from morn to night, and their numbers would run into the thousands. At least 20,000 people had Baba's blessing in 1926 on his 32nd birthday. Once an old man offered to dedicate everything he had to me, and then he would begin, he said, to lead a life of service and renunciation. However, on investigation, it was found that what would be dedicated to me was a wife and 7 children to be taken care of. On another occasion, a yogi called and sought my instructions, as he said he was determined to find God at any cost. I told him to wait for my instructions under a certain tree. He remained there for 7 days and walked away on the 8th, unnoticed by anyone. One of the characteristics of Baba's activities, which often puzzles people, is the manner in which he will suddenly and without warning stop a project in apparent mid-career, regardless of the degree of evident success it is experiencing. In November to December 1926, he did this to the institutions and services which were thriving at Mehrabad, closing them all lock, stock, and barrel. Baba commented cryptically on this singular trait of his as follows. Usually, a temporary scaffolding is set up around a big building which is under construction, and when the building is completed, the scaffolding is removed. Often my external activities and commitments are only the external expression of the internal work I am doing. In either case, my external activities and commitments may be continued indefinitely, or I may end them promptly at the end of the inner work, depending upon the prevailing circumstances. While showing the Sahavasis about Mehrabad Hill, Baba often told stories of the Meher Ashram and Prem Ashram days, 1927 to 1929. And there's a star that says, a detailed account is given in Sobs and Throbs, Ramju Abdullah, now unfortunately out of print. At that time, in addition to continuing my silence, I also gave up writing in January 1927. Shortly thereafter, I started to communicate by spelling out words on an English alphabet board, which I discarded recently in October 1954. The school known as Meher Ashram was started as a small day, next page, day school for the boys of the adjoining village of Arangaon. After some time, it was turned into a regular boarding school in May 1927 that housed more than 100 boys. Efforts were made to collect them from various cities and different countries. One of the mandali was sent to England for that purpose. None came from the West, but a number of boys from Iran did join the Meher Ashram. My first aim was to arrange for teaching the boys English through their various vernaculars by standards set up in the University of Bombay. Having accomplished this, I began to spend all of my time, day and night, on the general welfare and spiritual upliftment of the boys. Even though I had entrusted several mandali with the job of keeping watch over the boys round the clock, still I would frequently appear in the dormitory in the dead of night to see if they were well wrapped and sleeping all right. This was also the period when I carried out one of my longest continuous fasts, which lasted 5.5 months, from November 1927 to April 1928. Once during this period, I took nothing but a few sips of water for more than 28 days. The remainder of the time I lived on cocoa and milk taken once in 24 hours. Even this was in scant supply. As it happened, Lahu, Baba's favorite among the untouchable boys, used to carry my supply to me every day, and on the way he would drink half of it and then pass on the other half to me. I found out about this at the end of my seclusion, when the women mandali assured me that they had sent Lahu regularly, as I had originally instructed them, with the thermos bottle full of cocoa. When I questioned Lahu about this, he readily confessed, pilfering half my cocoa every day. I pardoned the little fellow as readily as he had acknowledged the guilt. During part of this period, I remained continuously indoors for more than 3 months, from November 1927 to February 1928, at the spot where my future tomb is located. I did not step out of the crypt, the underground part of Baba's future tomb, and the temporary small structure placed over it. The temporary hut has now been replaced by the present domed building. In the daytime, I spent most of the time in the upper room, which had 2 windows level with the floor, and at night I would retire into the crypt. One of the two windows in the upper room faced the Meher ashram on the east and was in line with a raised platform before the ashram. The boys and the mandali would sit on this, near me but outside my room, and I would give them discourses and carry on discussions with them with the help of my alphabet board. Through the west window, I would see the Sadak ashram, hermitage, which consisted of a string of small rooms standing at that time near my place of seclusion. Some of the mandali were also in seclusion in these small rooms, fasting under my directions on a small quantity of milk taken once or twice a day. The following account of one of the incidents which occurred during that period is adapted from Sobs and Throbs. On January 1, 1928, the 52nd day of Baba's fasting and the 12th of his self-imposed confinement, a majority of the boys began to break into tears at different times throughout the day. In the evening, matters came to a climax. Each boy in the ashram burst into tears and began to sob as if all his dear ones had suddenly been reported dead. For about 1 hour, between 7 and 8 in the evening, this awesome phenomenon held the onlookers spellbound. The tumult could be heard a quarter of a mile away from the ashram. Attempts were made by those in charge to quiet the boys and to find out the cause of the outburst, but it was all to no avail. All seemed to be engrossed in crying and deaf to all else. Baba, Baba were the only words which could be heard distinctly in all this tumult. Finally, the boys were brought close to Baba's presence, and with magical swiftness, they became silent again. Continuing his reminiscences to the Savasis, Baba said, at a later stage, March 1928, Meher Ashram was divided into two sections. The new portion was called Prem Ashram, Shelter of Love. In it were housed the boys most awakened to love. They were given some freedom from the daily school routine to allow for their preoccupation with meditation and the spiritual experiences that most of them periodically had. One of the boys from Iran, of about 18 years, lost consciousness of his body and surroundings for 4 days. Had an enema not been given to him, then at my orders, he would have died. Thereupon the boy regained ordinary normal consciousness, but not the consciousness which is regained after union with God, as that is an entirely different and unique achievement. For a long time afterwards, he would weep and complain bitterly about my having dragged him down from the blissful state in which he said he had seen nothing but Baba. When some of my internal work had to be done afresh in June 1928, both the ashrams were shifted root and branch to Toka, about 45 miles north of Ahmednagar. There, the area of my seclusion included the whole of the Prem Ashram. It was a picturesque spot at the junction of the rivers Godavari and Paravra. Swimming was added to the daily recreation of the boys. Here again, I fasted on a few sips of water and milkless tea for a number of days, 42 days, September through October 1928. The boys were overjoyed when I ended my fasting by drinking some orange juice. As it happened to be the birthday of Krishna, they insisted on carrying me in a palanquin around the new colony of Mehrabad dressed as Krishna. Singing and dancing, they tossed my palanquin back and forth. Due to the fast I had just ended, this jerky ride was excruciatingly painful for my abdomen. Out of my love for the boys and their love for me, I managed to remain cheerful at the time, but I suffered the physical consequences for 2 months afterwards. Often during the course of the Sahavas weeks, Baba would discuss the need to keep fit and avoid colds. Some of his most enlightening comments concerning his own physical susceptibilities were embodied in his reminiscences of his first trip to England in September 1931, not long after the closing of the Prem Ashram. Some of you might ask why, being the avatar, I could feel or catch cold. You might well ask also why I should feel hungry or need rest. We have bodies and they are naturally subject to all sorts of ailments, and as a consequence, we must suffer. Therefore, one should take all practical precautions to avoid and take proper treatment to recover from the bodily ailments. The God-realized ones who do not return to ordinary normal consciousness and yet happen to retain their bodies, the mazubs, have no body consciousness, just as they have literally no consciousness of anything other than their own self. Their own bodies also remain to them as nothing, and therefore nothing can affect nothing. As long as it is necessary, their infinitely conscious divinity directly supports their bodies within illusion as supports for the maintenance of the whole illusion of creation. Musts, who are mad and absorbed in God love, also remain immune as a rule to bodily ailments. The intensity of their smokeless fire of love neutralizes all bodily reactions, and thus they continue freely living their life of love for God. Once the God-realized soul comes down with his God consciousness to normal consciousness of the illusion of duality, then the physical body is even such a God-realized perfect master. Then the physical body of even such a God-realized perfect master is subject to ordinary contagion and disease. Simultaneously, I exist at every level, and as I am therefore on a level with your consciousness, then I suffer, experience, and enjoy just as you all do. On our first visit to England, I had not anticipated having to experience the bitter London cold without proper clothing. This came about due to the fact that the English Mandali were eager to perpetuate their remembrances of their first direct contact with me by taking pictures of me in garments such as I had worn in India. The warmth of their love and devotion compelled me to take off all my warm clothes. Then, for more than an hour, I allowed them to make me sit and stand in various poses, remaining cheerfully in the open air with only my cotton sadra on. They were very happy to get the pictures they wished, and I was no less happy to see them happy. However, I alone know how the cold bit to the very bone. The Westerners did not love me any less then, but they understand me more deeply now. In the automobile accident in Oklahoma of May 1952, several of us suffered very painful injuries, and a number of my bones were broken. However, the love all bore for me was quickened rather than shaken. In the distant past, as Krishna, I died physically when I was accidentally shot with an arrow. In his reminiscing, Baba also spoke often of the ashrams for the mad and the musts, which he conducted in his next period of external public activities, from 1936 through 1947. Most of the inmates of the Mad Ashram, August 1936 through September 1940, were gathered from among the ordinarily insane men who had no one to love or care for them. They were brought from near and far, regardless of caste or creed. No medical efforts were expended on treating their mental infirmities, but they were physically well attended, and they were indulged in my innocent idiosyncrasies. Baba planned and supervised the Mad Ashram, and he also served and nursed its inmates with patience, tolerance, and love. Aside from its humanitarian and spiritual aspects, the Mad Ashram also prepared the mandali for the subsequent running of the Must Ashrams. The 7 principal ones of these were maintained at different remote places such as Ajmer, Jabalpur, Bangalore, Meherbad, Ranchi, Mahabaleshwar, and Satara, 1939 to 1947. The nature of the external routine was common to both Mad and Must ashrams, just as there was considerable similarity between the externally alike but internally dissimilar inmates. Baba clarified that this similarity as follows. Ordinarily, it is very difficult, and curiously, it is impossible to distinguish between a madman and a must. One is actually mad, and the other appears to be mad. Internally, the two are poles apart. The mad has lost the power of correct reasoning. The must has transcended the limitations of intellect. A madman is mentally infirm. A must is spiritually enlightened. The mad have distorted ideas about their bodies and surroundings. The musts have an utter disregard for theirs because their hearts directly experience inner truths beyond the gross sphere, and they are more or less imbued with God love. Even in the Mad Ashram, there were a few musts, but most were more or less ordinarily madmen. One of the latter, Fakir Bua, assumed the airs of a sage. He would nod his head and utter monosyllables mechanically without any meaning, but his movements and utterances gave the appearance of his agreeing or disagreeing with what he heard. He also made frequent gestures with his fingers. However, this was only habit, as there was no sense or significance to the gestures, although the contrary is true in the case of a must. When the Mad Ashram was closed, September 1944, Fakir Bua, along with the rest of the insane, was sent back to the place from which he had come, Pune. Through a misunderstanding, a rumor spread through the grain market in Pune that Fakir Bua had returned from ashram as a saint. This error was discovered some months later when one of the mandali, who was searching for musts and saints for my work, heard that there was one in the Pune area whom hundreds of people worshipped. When the mandali had managed to jostle through the crowds, he found none other than poor old Fakir Bua sitting on cushions placed on a coarsely decorated platform, happily nodding his head to the crowds around him. There are undoubtedly many in India who are genuinely engaged in the search for truth, but the masses are more eager to win cheap material benefits through rare spiritual blessings. Equipped with long hair and an ochre-colored robe, the garb of the wandering holy man, an unscrupulous man can easily dupe hundreds among the masses here. If one person worships some individual, hundreds will quickly follow suit, hoping thereby to rid themselves of their immediate problems for the asking. Years ago, among the growing number of new mandali, there was one individual who followed carefully my directions to observe silence, keep fast, and do japs, which is repeating the name of God. After leaving the mandali, however, he began to pose as a saint and induced people to worship him. I sent him a word of warning against his pretentiousness, but he did not heed it. After some time, he became involved in an affair with a woman and ultimately returned to me suffering with leprosy. I pardoned him, embraced him, and advised him to go humbly about the country, giving my message of love and truth to the people. He is now no longer a leper and remains steadfast in his love and service for me. Although most of the mandali know of only 3 or 4 cases of such fraudulence, there have been 7 pretenders who have claimed falsely that they had been spiritually enlightened by me and were my spiritual successors. Musts are those who become permanently unconscious in part in part or whole of their physical bodies, actions, and surroundings, due to their absorption in their intense love and longing for God. My love for the musts is similar in many ways to that shown by a mother who continues to look lovingly after her children regardless of their behavior. To make her child clean, a mother does not even mind soiling her hands with a child's excrement. I am the mother of the musts. If God were not there, there would be no musts. They also are like parts of my body. Some are like my right, and some are like my left limbs and fingers. Some are nose, ears, and eyes for me. I am helpful to them, and they are helpful to me. The musts alone know how they love me, and I alone know how I love them. I work for the musts, and knowingly or unknowingly, they work for me. Discovering and collecting the mad had been child's play compared to the task of the mandali were now assigned to trace contact and induce the musts to come into the must ashram. Although Baba had started contacting the God mad in 1915, his regular must trips did not start until 1938. They remain to this day, 1957, one of the most active external manifestations of his internal work. A splendid account of 75,000 miles of Baba's must trips, in which he contacted 20,000 musts, as well as a description of Baba's mad and must ashram activities, has been given by one of the resident mandali, Dr. William Donkin, in his unique work, The Wayfarers, 1948, Meher Publications. Baba once pointed out 7 mango trees to a group of Sahavasis visiting Meherazad. These are the offshoot of one of my own cherished must contacts. This must had presented me with 7 mangoes. As I promised the must, I ate them all completely, and the 7 seeds I planted here, where you now see them grown into trees. As the mandali well know, I soon give away whatever I have chosen to receive, except what I receive from the musts. Even if they give me pieces of rags or waste paper, I treasure them. And later, I and those who accompany me to a must trip keep moving night and day for weeks at a time without regular or adequate meals, and only rarely do we rest for a night. On one such exceptional occasion, we were sleeping on a railway platform for the night. At daybreak, someone was found sharing my blanket with me. The stranger admitted on questioning that he was a petty thief known to the police. However, he insisted that he had not been trying to rob us, but to seek shelter for the night. The mandali were inclined to hand him over to the police, but I let him get away. From mid-October 1949 to the end of January 1952, Baba lived what he called his life of complete external renunciation. So far, no complete account has been written of it. The full story of the hardships and crises incident to the life of self-created helplessness remains known only to the companions Baba took with him in his new life adventure. These were the handful of men and women who had chosen and were allowed to participate in the venture. They traveled with him from place to place in distant parts of India, mostly on foot and under the most trying conditions, having no ready shelter, no money, and no day-to-day provisions to draw upon. Excuse me. Once, referring to the caravan built of an old mortar van, which is also preserved at Meherazad, Baba said, at a later stage of the new life, this was used as a ready shelter for the night for the women among my new life companions. The caravan was drawn by a pair of bullocks, which were the charge of the men. The men also had to take care of a camel, a horse, 2 donkeys, and 2 cows, which we took with us for a period. Eugene, do you mind taking over?
Thanks, Jay. Baba rules. My
Jai Baba.
companions suffered unimaginable hardships. At times, we used to beg for food and for other day-to-day requirements. The last period of over 2 months of the new life was spent at Merzad. During most of that time, I did my mononash, annihilation of the mind, work in seclusion. And it was then that the 2 cabins were removed from the seclusion hill and added to the seclusion area adjoining the garden. You who are here for my service are indeed fortunate that I am with you at these various spots at Merbad and Merzad, where I have done many of my internal and external works. 60 years from now, they will become world centers to which thousands will make pilgrimages, vying with each other to sacrifice their very lives in my name. At the completion of the Mononash period, Baba traveled to Europe and the United States, where the auto accident referred to above occurred. Arriving back in India in September 1952, he again plunged into his must work, as well as his fiery life. Fiery life is starred, and it says, See the Awakener, Volume 1, Number 1, and following. Back to the text. Numerous mass darshan programs were held in many villages, towns, and cities in different parts of India, drawing 5,000 to 50,000 people at a time. In one of the large darshan programs held at Ahmednagar in September 1954, several scores from Europe, America, and Australia also participated. Following the Savas programs in November 1955, Baba immediately began plans for a year's seclusion, starting February 15, 1956, broken only by his must work and a 1 month's flying trip around the world in the early fall of 1956 to greet his devoted followers on 4 continents. So that ends it for today. See you next week.